Good evening. My name is Arthur J. Simonet, and today I will be giving my presentation on law enforcement and the relationship between African Americans. Uh, Understanding the history of African Americans and law enforcement is one of the most important things. So I give a quick background on the history between law enforcement and African Americans. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, the government backed over $120 billion in home loans, but refused to give out loans to African Americans. This went on for decades. This practice is called redlining. Redlining is the practice of denying services either directly or through selective price raising or residents or certain areas based on the racial or ethnicity component of the area. So essentially, they weren't giving out loans to African Americans, which essentially forced African Americans into poor urban centers, which are now known as the ghettos. This maintains segregation to this day. This also made it difficult and impossible to invest into the African American community. This economically crippled the African American community with the inability to invest into properties and wealth like the Caucasians did back in the 30s and 60s between that time period. It is well known that uh, when you live in a better populated, better financial area, education is better funded. Uh, Property taxes fund the schools in that area, which can lead to a better education, more resources, and more connections. Unfortunately, African Americans that lived in ghettos lacked education opportunity and was relegated to minimum wage jobs, to manual labor, and forced them into blue collar jobs and bad living areas. And as you know, in bad living areas, it could easily be influenced by drugs. During the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the most popular drug used was crack and cocaine. Throughout, although crack was essentially the same as cocaine, the possession of crack had a harsher punishment than cocaine. The difference between crack and cocaine is that crack is a derivative of cocaine and is cheaply made and is predominantly found in ghetto areas such as, African American ghettos. Cocaine is a powdered substance that was known as the rich drug, was predominantly found in affluent areas, which is, just basically people who could afford this drug. It's known as the party drug, but they were essentially the same thing. It's just, crack was easier to make, cheaper to make, and was found in ghetto areas. This unfortunately was the start of some of the bad relationships between law enforcement and the African American community because certain laws started to target people of color and African Americans during the 60s and 70s and 80s during the crack and cocaine epidemic. Certain laws were changed, like during this time, like laws were changed that were heavily influenced, like stop and frisk and show me your papers, that were specifically targeted to black communities, and it started the bad relationship between law enforcement and African Americans because of the system. Uh, During that time, prisons became privatized. Uh, this during the 60s and 70s, the prison population shot up from 200,000 to 2.4 million during 1960 and 1995. Privatizing prisons is meaning it's a private prison, or for a nonprofit prison is a place in which individuals are physically confined and or incarcerated by a third party that is contracted by the government agency. Private prison companies typically enter a contract with the government, that agreement with government that commit prisoners and or prisons to per diem or monthly rate either for each prison or in the facility for each place available, meaning the more prisoners they would lock up, the better for the privatized business. So if a company needed, for example, cheap labor to make license plates, they would hire a prison, and a prison would get as many inmates as it can from the streets, predominantly from African American communities, for simple laws like stop and frisk them, which made them easier targets. They would fill up the prisons with African Americans, and they would be free labor. So some of this is some of the things that still goes on today with simple laws like stop and frisk, which still goes on today, and with little drugs such as marijuana, which would have a severe punishment. Some of the things that affected us during the 70s and 80s that really does not help the relationship between law enforcement and African Americans was the LA riots, which was a result of the Rodney King beating, which was Rodney King was an African American who was pulled over in 1993 or 4, who was brutally beaten by 5 Caucasian cops with nightsticks. That was recorded, and which sparked the LA riot after it went to trial and the cops were found not guilty for police brutality. There was massive corruption in the LAPD. There was tension between the police and the cops, which still go on to this day. As you may know, you could turn on the news and you'll see Eric cases like Eric Gardner and lots of cases that are just examples of cops unfairly harassing African Americans that are innocent or does not have a weapon on them, who are just having their lives taken from them, and it doesn't help the relationship between law enforcement and African Americans. There are a lot of things that can be done to heal the relationship between law enforcement and African Americans that could be implemented, but it's a system that has to start from the top and work its way down to the bottom. Some of the things that could be implemented in helping African Americans and law enforcement is policing the community inside the community, like having leaders in African American communities to police their own communities that would help law enforcement come in and help and not attack as soon as they come into the community. Developing a relationship with law enforcement, like such as ride-alongs, and seeing what the police have to go through in each scenario, which would help both sides of having an understanding of what the other goes through in certain situations. Uh, having a rapport with the community would definitely help law enforcement when it comes to the relationship with African Americans. Having a better understanding of the culture and behaviors in the culture with African Americans and law enforcement would also help the communication between the two. Diversifying law enforcement would be a major help, because it is shown that law enforcement are predominantly Caucasians. Excuse me. So having a more diverse law enforcement would help with understanding and communication. If you have African Americans and uh, white Americans working together in enforcement, it would make the relationship a little bit better. Um, some of these are just the essential, you know, these are just simple solutions to a really big problem. It is something that we can't fix overnight, but some of these things aren't as complicated as most make it seem. But these are little things that can help between African Americans and law enforcement. I thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope it was insightful. I hope I gave a little bit of information, and have a great day. Thank you.